Welcome to Darkness Notes Coaches, terrifying secrets, and mysterious stories that will make you tremble. The last thing she touched was velvet deep blue, almost black in the candlelight, the kind of fabric that devours light, like a void stitched into reality. And when she stepped into the fog that night, she stepped out of history itself. Goodbyes, no witnesses, no trace. Isabella Fairmont didn't just disappear, she was erased. But what if I told you her vanishing wasn't the end of her story? What if it was the beginning of something far more orchestrated, something designed to cleanse the sins of the powerful behind satin gloves and cigar smoke? Because, see, Isabella Fairmont wasn't just a socialite, she was the breach, the crack in the golden mask of the Gilded Age, and the hands that silenced her belonged to men whose names built cities and rewrote laws. This isn't gossip. This is a study in power, obsession, and disappearance as a weapon of control. Let's step into the fog together now. She was born into a world most men only read about, the kind where fortune wasn't earned but inherited, passed down like a sword drenched in history. Isabella Catherine Aldridge, daughter of a maritime titan and heiress to a bloodline older than the Union itself. Her father's ships carried opium and weapons long before anyone dared call it war. Her mother's family had buried secrets in the soil of Salem trials, executions, land grabs, soaked in blood and legacy. That's not poetic metaphor, that's public record, buried in county deeds and probate files that someone paid very well to keep unread. And when Isabella was born in 1859, she was born marked, a symbol of the fusion between old Puritan power and new industrial money. Her baptism, according to one witness, had more politicians than priests. She was never meant to be ordinary, and she never was. At 22. She married Theodore Fairmont, steel baron's son. They didn't fall in love, they merged. Think less romance, more economic treaty. Her dowry reshaped half of Pittsburgh's freight routes. His name opened every iron gate from Boston to Savannah. Together, they weren't just a couple, they were a fortress. But even fortresses crumbled. Newport was their playground. No, it was their stage. Rosecliff Manor was the setting, a 70-room cathedral to excess. But Isabella wasn't content to simply exist within wealth. She commanded it. Artists, senators, European royals, she summoned them like ghosts at a séance. If you received an invitation to her summer ball, your name was etched in society. If you didn't, you were exiled. She was that powerful. And yet, in 1884, something shifted. It began with the eyes of a stranger, Jonathan Pembroke, architect, or so he claimed. But the lines on his credentials were too clean, his past too curated. Gothic revivalist, European-trained, never married, handsome, intense, and for a woman like Isabella dangerous in all the right ways. Within weeks of his arrival, he was seen dining alone with her. Within months, he was a fixture at Rosecliff. At first it was dismissed. A woman of culture, mentoring a young visionary. But those who knew Isabella knew better. She wasn't interested in vision. She was hunting truth. And Pembroke, he was the kind of man who carried truth like a knife beneath his coat. That summer, her demeanor changed. Those who once feared disappointing her suddenly found her unreachable. Friends reported her laughing in ways they hadn't heard in years, reckless, full-bodied, almost like freedom, but freedom has a price. And in a town like Newport, there are no secrets, only delays. The rumors crystallized into poison. Gossip columns sharpened their pens. One called her a queen chasing ghosts. Another described Pembroke as a romantic predator with the charm of a viper. The whispers followed her like shadows, and they weren't wrong. Because Isabella was chasing ghosts, and she wasn't alone. C. Pembroke was more than an architect. He was a collector, not of art or furniture, but of entry into mansions, into vaults, into lives. He designed additions with secret compartments, hollow stairwells, false walls. For what? Not smuggling, not storage. Evidence. Isabella began to realize something. Newport's grandest estates weren't just homes, they were fortresses of hidden sin. Behind every column and carved balustrade lay documents, artifacts, letters, things that could ruin legacies and destabilize empires. Things men would kill to protect. In October of 1884, it all unraveled. The New York Herald published a full exposé, Newport's fallen angel. Anonymous sources, photos, bank records, even quotes from Pembroke's former lovers in Richmond and Pittsburgh. Suddenly, Isabella wasn't a queen. She was a scandal. Theodore blindsided, threatened divorce. Friends vanished. Invitations stopped. She was alone and now, dangerously aware. That's when she made a move no one expected. She didn't flee. She fought back. November 20th, 1884. Private meeting at the Belmont Hotel. Representatives from 5 of Newport's oldest families gathered. What she revealed terrified them. She named names, described secret compartments Pembroke had built, claimed to have copies of documents, bribery schemes, price-fixing conspiracies, forged land deeds, alleged that 3 families were using child labor on off-book estates, and that 1 senator had proof of ritual activity connected to a private Masonic lodge tied to Eastern Seaboard shipping monopolies. They wanted her gone. She gave them terms: $100,000, Pembroke's debts settled, safe passage to Europe. In return, silence. They agreed with stipulations: separate ships, separate departures, no return. Isabella smiled. She accepted the exile. But here's where it breaks. From the official record, December 2nd, 1884. She never boarded her ship, never claimed her ticket, never arrived in London. Pembroke vanished too, but not to England. No one ever found him again, and Isabella, she walked out of the Belmont Hotel the night before her departure, dressed in velvet, coat drawn tight, valise in hand. Fog swallowed her within 20 paces. She was never seen again. The police searched. Detectives combed Newport. They found letters burned, Oregon, bank accounts emptied, a ruby brooch pawned in Philadelphia days later, by a woman matching her description, speaking with a British accent. But there's more, something deeper, something blacker, because in 1892 a letter arrived at the Boston Globe office. No return address, no handwriting match. Inside was a single page typed on foreign paper. It said, "They feared I would speak, but the real horror wasn't what they did, it was what they believed, and what they worshipped. They didn't bury the evidence. They buried the witnesses. I was only the beginning." The letter was destroyed, officially, but not before a clerk made a copy. Now let me ask you something, brother. What if Isabella Fairmont didn't vanish? What if she was disappeared? Silenced, not by fear, but by ritual? You'll think Newport elite just bought art and drank champagne. No, they funded experiments, bought access to minds, to bodies, to children whose records no longer exist. They used their wealth not to build society, but to shield themselves from it. From consequences, from exposure, from justice. And Isabella, she may have been the only one who got close enough to understand what they were really protecting. We're not done. This rabbit hole goes deeper than velvet and fog. Stay with me. Because in the next section we follow the money to Europe. 2. Secret societies. 2 deaths rewritten as accidents and estates haunted not by ghosts but by guilt. And if you've made it this far, prove it in the comments below by writing, "Velvet doesn't vanish, it absorbs." Twice. Say it twice. Because when you speak truth like this, you're not just listening, you're transforming. You're not just awake, you're not just awake. She wasn't supposed to be there. That's what the housekeeper would later whisper behind locked doors in hushed tones only heard by the crows that seemed to multiply on the rooftops of Bellevue Avenue. She wasn't supposed to be in that room, not on that night, but she was. August 4th, 1889. Midnight had passed, and the sea air was heavy with salt, rot, and something else, something the Newport elite didn't speak of but feared with every fragile bone in their bodies. Celeste Renmore, heiress to the Renmore steam fortune, had not been seen since the first scream. Some say it wasn't a scream, but a kind of deep, guttural cry, like something ancient had been disturbed. But those who say that tend to say too much, and then vanish like Celeste did, sometimes leaving a bloodied shoe, sometimes just silence where a voice used to be. The party had been a masked affair, a tradition in the Renmore family to mark the summer's last moonrise. Red velvet, drapes in the ballroom, black wax candles, masks carved from whalebone and ivory. The wealthy were already fading into a kind of madness by then. Seances in the library. Children who didn't speak until they were 8 but could play batch flawlessly. Celeste was the light they all paraded around, but only because she hadn't yet seen what flickered behind her family's mirror. She had recently returned from Paris, where her tutors claimed she was far too curious for her own bloodline. In letters now archived in secret vaults, she writes to her confidant, Amelinde O'Shears, "The dreams are returning, but they are no longer mine. They belong to someone else, someone trapped in velvet and screaming without sound." Investigators who stepped foot inside the Renmore estate would later describe the second-floor hallway as colder than the rest of the house. Not drafty, cold, like a breath held too long. The staff refused to clean room 9 after the disappearance. Maids reported hairpins moving on their own, and in one terrifying instance, a young stable boy claimed he saw Celeste standing in the hallway mirror, but her eyes had no pupils, just voids where something watched back. Of course, the Renmores paid off the authorities. Sheriff Amos Herold retired a week later, bought a mansion in Maine, and never gave interviews. His final note to the department was one line: "The girl is gone, but she was not taken." The press spun their own stories. Heiress flees with lover. Celeste Renmore joins theater troupe. Scandal at Bellevue. But the truth was darker. 2 days before her vanishing, Celeste had taken communion in a private chapel not listed in any architectural plan of the house. Witnesses describe her face as pale, as if drained of something vital. Her governess reported that Celeste had been reciting strange phrases in French, but not the kind she learned in Paris. Older, more guttural, almost pre-human. The communion was officiated by a man with no known origin. Photographs of the event blur at the edges, and no one can recall his name. Some called him the Velvet Priest. The term stuck in certain circles, cult-like ones that remember old gods with new names. During the weeks following her disappearance, the garden turned. Roses withered overnight. Trees stopped producing shade. The stone fountain in the center, once clear and bubbling, turned a deep red, like wine but thicker. House staff quit in waves. New ones were brought in from Salem and Delaware, places familiar with whispers. One maid 30 years in service spoke to a reporter off record. She was called. "Not stolen," she said. "The family made a pact. The velvet isn't cloth, it's a veil. And some veils, once lifted, can never be replaced." But the most disturbing piece wasn't the garden, or the chapel, or even the mirror. It was the letter, found in Celeste's handwriting, dated the day before she vanished. It was sealed and addressed to herself. Inside, "I see me watching me. I am not inside anymore." No one could explain it. Handwriting experts confirmed authenticity. Linguists debated whether it was metaphor or madness, but those who knew the Renmore family really knew them knew better. The Renmore women had a pattern. Celeste's mother, Annette, died during childbirth. Her body was buried in a closed casket after what the doctor called irreversible facial trauma. Her aunt drowned in the bathtub, clutching a small velvet pouch in her hand. Her grandmother was declared mad at 30, painting the same image over and over: aunt, empty ballroom with a single masked figure in red velvet. Celeste had once confided in a friend at a boarding school in Switzerland, "I don't think my family is cursed. I think we are the curse." That friend died 6 months later. Pneumonia, they said, but her lungs were filled with salt water. The night after Celeste vanished, lightning struck the estate 3 times. No storm in sight. A meteorologist from Providence claimed it was the only triple strike recorded that year. But the strange part, all 3 bolts hit the same window, Celeste's bedroom. The glass remained unbroken, only the reflection inside warped, as if something had been pulled inward. Over the next year, guests at the estate reported dreams of velvet corridors, endless and shifting. Some woke up with nosebleeds. One woman tore out her own fingernails after waking, muttering, "The seams are not sewn shut." Her husband sent her to an asylum outside Hartford. The Renmore estate fell into a kind of decay that money couldn't fix. The family stopped entertaining. The ballroom was sealed. The private chapel was bricked over, and room 9 was padlocked with chains that glittered faintly under moonlight, as if warning rather than guarding. In 1893, 4 years after Celeste disappeared, a young girl newly hired to dust the West Wing opened a small music box she found in the attic. It played a haunting melody none could place, but the lyrics were written in the lid, scrawled in blood. "The velvet hums when the forgotten come." She was never seen again. Her parents sued, settled quietly. The Renmore name began to shrink from society pages. No heirs, no parties, just silence and the sea. Until 1931, a team of urban explorers broke into the long-abandoned estate. One returned barely, his hair turned white, his nails rotten. He refused to speak, but scratched one phrase into a hospital wall before being committed. "She's still in the mirror, but she's not alone." Decades passed. Then, in 1978, a historian named Dr. Eleanor Vance reopened the case. She specialized in lost women of the Gilded Age. Her research led her to Newport. She bribed her way into the Renmore ruins. What she found, she never revealed, but her notes, found after her mysterious drowning off Goat Island, include sketches of a woman in red velvet with no face, only a smooth surface, like silk stretched over something hungry. Her last entry, "The velvet isn't the prison. It's the key." Now, in modern times, the story has become folklore. College students dare each other to say Celeste's name into mirrors. Occult forums pass around digital scans of her final letter. But one thing remains constant: no one who digs too deep lasts long. Podcasts are pulled, articles erased, and every few years, someone reports seeing her at the edge of the ocean. just before sunrise, her red gown trailing into the surf, her reflection walking faster than her body. Perhaps she was never meant to vanish. Perhaps she was meant to return. But return as what? The final question isn't where Celeste went, it's what came back in her place, and whether the velvet was ever really just fabric, or the skin of something much older, waiting to be worn again. The garden party was the last place anyone saw her, draped in black velvet despite the heat. Madeline Ashcombe walked alone through the hedge maze while the brass quartet played something haunting. She'd already refused champagne, avoided the mayor's son, and turned away when her own mother raised a glass in her honor. No one thought much of it. The Ashcombes were known for their eccentricities, but when midnight came and the estate gates closed, her absence turned from curious to chilling. Her slippers were found at the edge of the reflecting pool, one pressed neatly beneath the other as if she'd taken them off before stepping into a different world. But no one saw her leave. No carriage passed through the gates. No servant heard her scream. And the dogs, the bloodhounds her father imported from Belgium to protect the orchard, refused to go near the maze after dark. In the days that followed, posters were printed, rewards were offered, and search parties sent out through the surrounding forest. But none returned with so much as a shred of velvet or a strand of her raven hair. Something more disturbing happened instead. One by one the servants began to leave. The housekeeper, who had served 3 generations of Ashcombes, packed her bags without warning and left behind only a note that read, "You cannot keep what was never yours." The butler, a proud man of military bearing, was found sobbing behind the chapel, muttering about voices in the walls and children in the floorboards. And then there was the governess, who walked into the ocean one morning and didn't stop until she disappeared beneath the waves. Rumors erupted like plague boils. Some claimed Madeline was a witch, that her bloodline came from Salem stock, that her grandmother had been seen burning herbs and muttering over dolls made of wax and hair. Others whispered she was pregnant, that the child belonged to someone beneath her station, and that her disappearance was a cover for shame, or worse. But those were the mild theories. The darker ones, spoken only in Newport's backrooms and abandoned cottages, suggested something ancient had claimed her, that she'd been promised, that the Ashcombes had always paid a price for their wealth, and this time, it came in the form of their only daughter. The church remained quiet on the matter, too quiet. Reverend Halley, who had baptized Madeline himself, refused to comment and soon left town altogether. But the most disturbing detail wasn't found in sermons or gossip. It came from a 7-year-old boy named Elias Breen, the gardener's son. Elias had been playing by the hedges that night and claimed to have seen her standing motionless in the center of the maze. Her eyes rolled back, her hands held out like she was offering something to the air. He said the trees around her moved, but there was no wind. He said something stepped out of the shadows, something that looked like a man but wore no face. And he said Madeline didn't scream. She bowed, then she vanished. The boy's story was dismissed by authorities. His father was told to keep him silent, but years later, when Elias was committed to a sanatorium after attempting to blind himself, he kept repeating the same phrase. She asked them to take her. She asked them. Meanwhile, the Ashcombe estate was sold in silence. The family moved west, their name scrubbed from local records. The house stood empty for decades, slowly being consumed by ivy and fog, until 1922, when a group of college students, interested in occult folklore, decided to explore the ruins. They documented everything: the claw marks on the inside of the cellar door, the melted wax figures lined up beneath Madeline's old bed, and a diary half buried beneath floorboards in the nursery. The diary was not hers. It was dated 1864 and belonged to a girl named Emmeline Ashcombe, aunt never listed in family trees. Her last entry read, "I heard them in the maze again. They want another. The velvet marks, the chosen." That diary disappeared after the students returned. One of them, a theology major named Harper Vane, was found hanged in the campus bell tower the following year. His final essay, turned in days before his death, was titled, "The Ashcombe Rite, Bloodline, Sacrifice, and the Velvet Curse." It was confiscated. His parents never spoke of it. Madeline's name faded from memory like steam from a mirror. But every few years, a new whisper surfaced: a tourist disappearing near the cliffs, a child describing a woman in velvet standing outside their window at night, a librarian discovering pages ripped from local birth records, all dated the same day, September 3rd, 1889, and yet no trace of Madeline herself. No bones, no hair, no body, only shadows, only velvet. In 1971, a journalist named Clara Yates reopened the case for a radio segment on vanished socialites. She dug deep, too deep. She interviewed surviving servants, tracked down Elias Breen's sanatorium records, and even managed to obtain a photograph from the 1889 garden party. The photo is famous now. In it, Madeline stands slightly apart from the crowd, but what Clara noticed wasn't Madeline, it was the shape behind her in the hedge, barely visible. A figure, tall and thin, with a blank space where the face should be. Clara's segment never aired. Her tapes were confiscated by federal agents, the official reason. National security concerns. She was fired days later, but she left copies with her sister, who leaked parts of the transcript in the early 2000s. That's how the legend grew. Vira Dark, whispered in digital corners. Madeline Ashcombe became a symbol, a warning, a mystery unsolved not because no one tried, but because something stronger didn't allow it. And there's one more detail, one that haunts the Historical Society to this day. In 2019, during a renovation of Newport's town hall, workers discovered a sealed chamber beneath the foundation. It contained only 3 things: a velvet glove, a silver locket with the Ashcombe crest, and a mirror. The mirror wasn't dusty or broken, it was clean, reflective, and in it, they said, no one saw themselves, but they did see a woman, standing in a hedge maze, waiting. She left no diary, no letters, no farewells, no note tucked under a pillow, no cryptic lines scribbled on a napkin, just silence, monolithic and suffocating, the kind of silence that doesn't just follow you home, but slips beneath your skin, and makes a home of you. And in the aftermath of Marguerite Stanhope's disappearance, Newport wasn't just rattled, it was cracked open like a bone-revealing marrow, because the town knew things it wasn't supposed to. It had seen things, old things, dark things, things that should have stayed buried beneath the velvet drapes of opulence and propriety. But once she vanished, the masks came off. The ballroom music faltered, and what stood beneath the grandeur of the Stanhope name was not nobility, it was rot. That's where it begins, really, not with her vanishing, but with what it exposed. In the weeks after, whispers emerged like steam rising off a corpse. Servants, those invisible eyes and ears of the wealthy, began to speak in shudders. They spoke of candles lit in locked rooms long past midnight, of voices echoing behind closed doors when no one was there, of mirrors covered not with cloth, but with inscriptions etched into glass like warnings or invocations. Latin, one maid said, not as curses. She was dismissed the next morning without pay. Then there were the deliveries, crates arriving in the dead of night, labeled in unfamiliar dialects, reeking of soil and salt water. One dock worker said he saw a figure, tall, veiled, motionless, standing beside the crates. He swore it didn't blink, swore it didn't breathe, swore that when he looked directly at it, something inside him went silent, like a song ending in the middle of a note. But Newport laughed it off. They had to, because if they didn't, the whole façade would collapse. The Stanhope estate, after all, was more than a home, it was a pillar, a symbol, a shrine to the illusion that wealth equals safety, that elegance erases sin. But Marguerite's disappearance ripped through that lie like lightning, and the storm that followed was not of thunder but of memory, repressed, rotten, resurfacing. It was in the archived letters of Reverend Thaddeus Crane that the first written accounts of what lay beneath Stanhope Manor emerged. His private correspondence in a hollowed-out Bible in the church crypt described rituals held in the lower quarters of the estate, rituals that predated the founding of Newport, circles carved into stone, salt patterns renewed with blood, and names chanted that were not human, names that did not want to be remembered, names that demanded offerings, and every offering, he wrote, required innocence. The estate's black marble fountain, once a place of beauty, became something else in his letters, a gateway, a mouth, one that drank more than water, one that pulsed at night. Crane died in 1866. His death was ruled a heart attack, but his heart was missing when they found him, and it wasn't the only thing missing that year. 3 children vanished, and their names, scrawled in the margins of Crane's journal, matched the inscriptions found beneath the fountain's basin, visible only under moonlight. But again, the town looked away. Convenient amnesia. Protect the name, protect the wealth, protect the illusion, until Marguerite, she wasn't just a girl with a fortune. She was the thread that unraveled the whole tapestry. Because she asked questions, she stayed up late. She walked the halls her ancestors had sealed. She peeled the wallpaper back with her bare hands and found symbols scorched into the wood, symbols that matched those in Crane's letters. She wrote about them, pages and pages, hidden beneath the floorboards of her study, discovered only after her disappearance. But the writings didn't stop there. No, they moved, or rather, they continued. Identical pages began appearing in the bedrooms of children across Newport, folded neatly beneath pillows, written in Marguerite's hand, describing dreams of being watched from the corners of rooms, of mirrors showing not reflections but rooms that didn't exist, of shadows with fingers longer than should be possible. The parents burned them, of course, called it a prank, a hoax, but one mother kept hers, and she paid the price. Within days, her child stopped speaking, stopped blinking, sat for hours staring into the corner where the ceiling met the wall, and when he finally opened his mouth to speak, he didn't say a word. He screamed, one long breathless wail that lasted nearly 40 seconds before he collapsed. His eyes bled. He was never the same again, and yet, the story still isn't about Marguerite alone. It's about the door she opened, the one beneath Stanhope Manor, the one no one built, the one that was simply there. Marguerite wrote of it once, one entry. No embellishment, no poetry, just 5 words. It watches when I sleep. The next page in her journal is torn out, and that's the last entry she ever made. They found her room untouched, her bed unslept and her candle still burning, but she was gone. No struggle, no blood, just a scent in the air, faint, metallic, not quite copper, not quite rot. Some say it was the scent of old iron, others say it was older than that, older than the manor, older than Newport, older than names. The manor has since been demolished, or so they claim, but the land remains sealed, fenced off, guarded, with no explanation. Locals avoid it, animals won't go near it, birds don't fly over it, and sometimes, late at night, there's a sound barely audible like laughter echoing from beneath the ground, and those who hear it don't sleep well again, not ever, because Marguerite Stanhope may have vanished, but what she found, it didn't. It waits. Still, in a room too grand for comfort and too still for time. The scent of lavender and blood lingered beneath the polished veneer. It was July 19, 1889, when the servants at Rosemary House discovered that the bed of Miss Adelia Vonther, 23-year-old, Newport Heiress, had not been slept in. The candles were burned to their base. Her slippers were beneath the chair, but her gloves were missing. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints, no carriage sounds remembered by the night staff, only silence. It was the kind of silence you didn't just hear, but felt like a pressure on your chest. And in that stillness, the legacy of a girl descended from a bloodline that whispered more curses than lullabies vanished like a name not meant to be spoken. The family, of course, denied everything. The Vaughans always did. For nearly a century they had trained their faces to remain statuesque in grief, in scandal, in secret. But that morning, the butler's hands trembled as he poured tea, made vomited behind the east hedges, and the patriarch, Harrison Vaughan III, called for the priest before he called for the constable, not because he feared death, but because he feared what might return in her place. You see, Adelia was not the first Vaughan to disappear. She was the 5th. Each one had vanished before their 24th birthday. Each one left no trace, only an inheritance tied to an ancient land grant and a ritual older than the colony itself. They were always women, always daughters, always born under the new moon in July. The newspapers printed the usual: runaway heiress, mental fragility, the burden of wealth and youth. But none of them published what was carved into the stone, well hidden, behind the stables, the one no gardener ever trimmed near, and no child ever dared play beside. On that stone were the names of the missing Vaughan daughters, but not in English. It was a script older than Latin, resembling a twisted loop of roots and veins. Those who could read it claimed it was a covenant and ancestral agreement sealed in flesh. The truth of what happened to Adelia was not written in any ledger or diary. It was not spoken in court or gossiped in parlors. It was remembered in the bones of the house, in the way the windows rattled without wind, in the way the mirrors darkened during prayer. In the week before she vanished, Adelia began speaking to a wall in her room, not shouting, not whispering, but conversing, calmly, like an old friend had come to call. The maid, Lottie, overheard her saying the same phrase again and again: "You promised they would forget." At first, it seemed like the eccentricities of a girl raised on too much solitude and too many dead ants, but then the birds stopped nesting in the eaves. The clocks ran backward for an hour on the morning of July 12th, and on the 14th the groundskeeper slit his own throat without warning, carving into his chest a symbol that matched the one etched into Adelia's childhood journal, the one she said came to her in dreams when the sky was wrong. This was no ordinary disappearance. This was an extraction. Something had come to claim her, and whatever it was, the family knew it was coming. That's why Harrison Vaughan locked the Red Room in the attic 2 days before she vanished. That room was never entered without 3 people and a vial of ash. The last time someone opened it alone, a fire started that burned for 6 minutes and left no damage. Only the birds in the trees died that day. Every single one within a half-mile radius. After Adelia vanished, the family moved to shut the estate. But there was one letter she had sent to a Dr. Lysander Quince, a name that would be erased from the university archives 6 months later. The letter read, "They want me to forget, but the wall remembers. The orchard roots are not fed by rain. I've seen her. She's me. She's wearing my face, but her eyes are older than God." Dr. Quince came to Rosemary under false pretense. He posed as a landscape historian interested in 18th century gardening rituals. But his notebooks, those smuggled out by his assistant, revealed something far more sinister. He wrote of geometric patterns beneath the soil, ley lines converging. Directly beneath Adelia's bedroom, he wrote of a scream he heard, not with his ears, but with his mind, at precisely 3:17 a.m., and he wrote of a doll, one that appeared at the foot of his bed, dripping wet and blinking slowly, whispering the name Thornchard. The last entry in his notebook said only, "The orchard is inverted. The root feeds the fruit, but not from above. I must return her, or she will return me." He was never seen again. Some say he went mad, others believe he was taken like her. But one thing was clear: Adelia Vaughan had touched something. Something old, something the family had buried under layers of civility and lace. The townsfolk started noticing things. Every 7th night, a girl who passed the estate would develop a fever and wake up speaking a language no one could place. Cattle would walk backwards until dawn. And on July 19th of the following year, a different girl vanished, same birthday. No known relation, but identical to Adelia in every physical aspect. The investigation was buried under bureaucracy, but the priest who came to Rosemary that first morning, he drank himself to death a month later, leaving behind a single page torn from a book that did not exist. The words read, "She is the mirror that breaks back, the soul split by lineage, each daughter a vessel, each vessel a key." What were they unlocking? What had the Vaughans done in the 1600s, during those early settler nights when blood bought land and secrets sealed survival? In 1651, a woman named Temperance Vaughan was tried for consorting with unseen men of fire and ash. The records claim she was burned, but her grave is empty, and her portrait still hangs in the drawing room at Rosemary, though no artist remembers painting it. And if you look long enough, the face shifts. Not all at once, just enough that when you blink, the eyes no longer belong to the woman you thought you knew. They belong to Adelia, or maybe the thing wearing her skin. The Vaughan family still exists today, scattered, diluted, but every July, they send letters, always postmarked from Newport, always unsigned, and always containing a single phrase, "One must remember so the rest can forget." What if forgetting isn't protection, but payment? What if each vanished girl wasn't lost but given? If you stand by the well behind the stables on the night of a new moon in July, some say you can hear her, not crying, not screaming, laughing, because maybe she was never the victim. Maybe Adelia Vaughan was the door, and someone, something, walked through. The local paper called it the departure of the century, a title wrapped in lace and ivory, as if words could soften the bone-deep panic that settled over Newport like a heavy fog. Behind those manicured hedgerows and marbled parlors, there was a silence more terrifying than screams, the kind of silence that follows a disappearance too perfect, too clinical, too rehearsed. In the weeks after Isadora Wentworth vanished, the grand halls of the estate stood untouched, her gloves still resting on the foyer table, her perfume still lingering on the stair banister. Every clock in the house had stopped at 4:17 p.m., the hour her lady's maid claimed to have last seen her, but there were no broken gears, no mechanical faults. Every clock, across 3 floors, had simply ... stopped, as if something far beyond comprehension had frozen time itself for a moment, sealed her absence into the architecture like a mausoleum. Her fiancé Nathaniel Bexley, heir to the Bexley shipping empire, grew skeletal in weeks. They said he refused to touch her belongings, kept her room exactly as it was, and burned every letter she had ever written to him, save one, the one she wrote the night before she vanished. It was unsigned, no greeting, no goodbye, only a single sentence scribbled in hurried ink. "They said I was born on borrowed breath, and now it's time to return it." The police dismissed it as poetic nonsense from a young woman burdened by nerves and legacy. The Wentworth family insisted on discretion. No public inquiry, no reward, no bodies dredged from the bay. Because there wasn't one, no body, no trace, no scream in the night, just silence and one vanished girl in velvet. but those closest to the family whispered other things. The gardener claimed he found a perfectly circular patch of scorched earth behind the greenhouse the next morning. The housekeeper, a stout woman who'd worked for the Wentworths for 31 years, resigned that very day and was never heard from again, and the priest from the parish was said to have paid a visit to the estate a week earlier, not to bless the home, but to bury something beneath the chapel floor, a wooden box, sealed in tar and lined with white feathers, its contents unknown. 2 servants claimed they heard weeping from beneath the chapel days later, but when the foundation was quietly excavated in 1890, it was completely dry, no tomb, no cavity, no disturbance. The box was gone. The weeping had stopped. The archives at the Newport Historical Society list her as missing, presumed deceased, but even those records are curious, because the ink on the entry fades halfway through her name, and the archivist's notes include a scrawled margin warning: "Do not reopen inquiry without ecclesiastical clearance." No one could explain how such a note ended up in a municipal record, but the priest who signed off on it was transferred to an abbey in Austria shortly after. He died 2 weeks later in what the papers called a self-inflicted sealing at ritual suicide by bricking oneself inside a chapel wall. Disappearance was one of many in that decade, though hers was the only one that rattled the elite, because the others were poor girls, factory hands, migrant children, servants, ghosts of the working class, gone before they were ever known. But Isadora was a debutante, a portrait in every hallway, and names spoken over every teacup. When she vanished, the fabric of safety tore a little for the wealthy, and so they buried it fast, replaced her with a cousin at family events, retouched her portraits to look like someone else. But the staff at the estate kept remembering. They talked of the months leading up to her disappearance, how she had taken to standing in the mirror for hours, not brushing her hair or adjusting her gown, just staring. Once, a maid swore she heard Isadora whispering, "It's not my reflection anymore." They found dozens of her sketches hidden in a locked drawer, each one more disturbing than the last. Faceless women standing on cliffs, black birds with human eyes, a garden where every flower had a mouth, and always, in the corner of each page, a symbol, 2 overlapping circles with a line through the middle, not a family crest, not a known cipher, but carved into the underside of her dressing table, the back of her music box, even burned into the inner lining of her shoes. That same symbol, a mark she left like breadcrumbs or, perhaps, warnings. The estate's groundskeeper reported strange disruptions in the hedge maze, pathways restructured overnight, statues turning to face different directions, and once a pair of boots found walking without feet inside them. They were hers, embroidered, custom-made, the laces still tied, number tracks before or after, just walking on their own. There were rumors about the family lineage, too, that the Wentworths were not purely of English descent but had roots in something much older, something older than surnames. There were whispers of ancient pacts, land bought with more than coin, of a midwife who delivered every Wentworth child for 5 generations but never aged, never moved, lived in a cottage on the edge of the forest and spoke a language no one could place. She was never seen again after Isadora vanished, and her cottage, burned to the ground by lightning, though the skies were clear that night. The wood smoldered for 3 days, and nothing inside survived except a single scrap of vellum bearing one sentence in Latin. Ego non patui, tenor, email tray. I could not hold her any longer. What exactly was meant to be held, no one ever said. In 1893, 4 years after Isadora's disappearance, a young woman was admitted to the Elm Grove Asylum in upstate New York. She had no name, no possessions, and refused to speak for weeks. But when she did, it was in perfect French, quoting Baudelaire. She said her name was Laura Wren, and that she was hiding from the ones who wear the mirror masks. Her description of the Newport estate was too precise to be a coincidence. She knew the number of balusters on the 3rd-floor staircase, knew which tiles squeaked in the solarium, knew the name of Isadora's horse, which had never been published. The staff grew uneasy, especially when she began drawing again. The same faceless women, the same garden of mouths, and always the same strange symbol. She hanged herself with a curtain cord in 1895. Her body disappeared from the morgue. The record clerk resigned and became a monk. The doctor who treated her vanished while crossing the Atlantic. Gone, just like Isadora. And yet, in 1901, a letter arrived at the Newport estate. No return address, no date, just a note on yellowed paper. Your daughter was the last gate. You must not open another. The handwriting matched Isadora's journals exactly, but the paper was dated using a pulp and watermark style not invented until 1911 years after she vanished. By then the Wentworths had already relocated to Vienna. The estate was sold to the Benedictines, who turned it into a silent retreat for nuns who had taken the vow of enclosure. They never spoke to outsiders, and when interviewed they claimed that sometimes, at dusk, they saw a figure in velvet walking the old orchard path, never turning, never responding, just vanishing at the same point every time, the exact spot where the scorched circle had once appeared. The estate remains abandoned today. Locals won't go near it, not because they believe in ghosts, but because they say the land breathes, like something underneath is not dead but waiting. And if you listen closely, especially at 4:17 in the afternoon, you can hear a second heartbeat in your chest, a borrowed breath just waiting to be returned. Her name was stitched into the lining of a lavender glove, just a faint thread, nearly worn away from age and weather. Evelyn Beatrice Alden, heiress, debutante, and for over a century, an open wound in Newport's memory. That glove, found buried in the hollow of a scorched elm near Breaker's mansion, was the last physical trace of her existence. No bones, no dress, no shoes, but the glove remained folded like a final whisper, and that glove has passed through 27 hands since, each of them dying under strange, hushed circumstances. You see, Evelyn's story was never just about a disappearance. It was about something that vanished with hers, something deeper than wealth or status, something old, something that every gatekeeper in the Ivy League corridors and the polished parlors of New England tried to erase. They feared her, not because she was powerful, but because she knew something. And in 1889, a girl with forbidden knowledge was far more dangerous than a man with a gun. Before she vanished, Evelyn visited a private library in Boston that no longer appears on any map and annex that housed medieval texts confiscated during the French witch trials. She went in under a pseudonym, signed the ledger, and by the time she returned to Newport, something in her gaze had changed. She no longer laughed in public, she no longer danced at Rosecliff, she spoke to no one at dinner, but she walked, often alone, always at twilight, toward the cliffs near Oka Point, holding a small, leather-bound book that no maid, servant, or friend ever dared touch. When her governess finally opened Evelyn's locked room 3 days after she failed to appear for breakfast, they found a bed untouched, a window wide open, and a circle of white feathers around a burnt hole in the floor. There was no fire, no signs of struggle, just that scorched wood, and the smell witnesses said it was like crushed violets laced with sulfur. The maid who cleaned the room the next day lost her vision by nightfall. The housekeeper died in her sleep. The physician who declared Evelyn a missing person was later found in a sanitarium, scribbling her name over and over in a dead language no one recognized. And yet, not a single police report mentioned this. Instead, the Alden family paid handsomely for the press to write it off as a young woman's private despair, a suicide by sea, a fall from the cliffs. No body needed, no questions asked. But Newport didn't forget, because every year on the night Evelyn disappeared, all the horses in the stables at Bellevue Avenue break into a coordinated panic, bucking eyes white with terror, and all the clocks in the Alden estate stop for exactly 6 minutes, the exact time Evelyn was last seen. At 12:06 a.m., wearing a silver nightgown, stepping barefoot into the orchard with her book and a candle. People say the orchard rots from the inside now. Blossoms form, but the fruit collapses before it's ripe. There's a cellar under that orchard, but no one's allowed to enter it. And when one boy tried in 1967, he came out speaking in tongues. His family moved to Maine the next morning and never returned. And then there's the mirror. Yes, the mirror, a Baroque antique Evelyn brought from her grandmother's estate in Belgium. She insisted it be placed across from her bed. Its frame was carved with vines and lions, but beneath the gilded finish, the wood was cypress cemetery wood. A parlor trick, perhaps. Until the new owners of the Alden estate began to notice something strange, the mirror would fog on clear days. And once, when a visiting professor leaned in to inspect its craftsmanship, he collapsed, clutching his throat. A post-mortem revealed his lungs were full of seawater, the same seawater that no body of Evelyn was ever recovered from, the same tides that locals swear rise a little higher each year on the anniversary of her vanishing, the same waters where no fish swim near the cliffs anymore. Evelyn's childhood diary, kept in secret by a servant girl named Clara, later revealed something far more disturbing than the public ever knew. Pages described voices in the orchard at night, whispers in French and Latin, descriptions of visitors who appeared only in reflection, and something she called the one below the roots. Clara tried to burn the diary. It wouldn't catch. The pages refused fire, so she buried it in a box lined with salt and rosemary. swearing never to tell another soul, until her great-granddaughter, a folklorist, unearthed it in 1991 while restoring the family barn. She read it. She published a paper. She died less than a year later in a fire with no source of ignition. Everything carbonized except the box, still intact, still lined with salt, still holding the diary. That diary was sent to a private collector, and then it vanished, just like Evelyn, just like the others. This is not coincidence. Evelyn Alden was never an ordinary girl. Her lineage, traced carefully through records hidden by the Jesuits, ties her to a bloodline of French mystics burned at the stake in 1449. Women said to carry the echo of Babel, a voice that could speak to that which lives in the shadows between our world and another, a voice trained, not inherited, a ritual performed only on the 16th birthday under a lunar eclipse. And yes, Newport had one in 1889, April 14th, Evelyn's birthday. The night the sea moaned louder than the wind, the night the family dog jumped from the roof, the night the housekeeper found Evelyn's bed surrounded by those white feathers. This is no myth. This is suppression. The Alden family paid enormous sums to Yale archivists to lose certain ancestral manuscripts. Brown University buried 3 doctoral theses under non-disclosure agreements, and one former historian for the Newport Preservation Society went silent after claiming Evelyn's bloodline was still active, still practiced, and still watching. Watching for what, you ask? For the one who will return the book, for the one foolish or brave enough to open it under the right moon. There are those who say Evelyn was taken, others believe she opened something she could not close, but the most compelling theory, she was not taken, she crossed, not alone, and not empty-handed. The orchard was not where she disappeared, it was where she entered a threshold, a gate, and every year since, on the stroke of midnight, that orchard sighs, the trees lean, the air thickens, and if you stand very still, you'll hear footsteps on dry leaves, but see no one. Some say she walks still, others say she waits, but one thing is certain. Evelyn Beatrice Alden did not vanish without a trace. The trace is all around us, in the tides, in the trees, in the mirrors, that fog without reason, and in the glove now sealed in a vault in New York still faintly smelling of violets and ash, underneath the sweeping chandeliers of the Vanderbilt estate, amid the velvet-draped halls and polished mirrors that never forgot a face. There were whispers, not the kind you hear in gossip columns or over champagne. These whispers came in the night, through the walls, and they spoke of Charlotte's last known days. She had been seen in a black silk gown, gliding through the gardens barefoot, muttering in French. One servant claimed she had torn pages from a French diary and burned them in the fountain, but by then the staff had learnt not to question her behavior. Her parents had dismissed her erratic moods as an overactive imagination, the hallmark of a creative woman. But the private letters her father kept locked in his desk painted a different portrait, one of a girl unraveling under a pressure. No one could name. The letters from Charlotte had shifted in tone over the months, growing darker, more paranoid. She spoke of watchers in the orchard, a silver-eyed woman with a veil who followed her in mirrors, and of something buried beneath the nursery, a phrase she repeated over and over. On the morning of October 3, 1889, a maid entered Charlotte's room and found her bed untouched, the window open, her slippers placed neatly beneath the vanity. Her perfume bottle, always kept closed, had been shattered, the scent of roses thick in the room. There was no sign of struggle, no trace of blood, and most oddly, no footprints outside the window. Despite the heavy dew that morning, Newport was silent. The town refused to speak openly, but the society papers swirled with speculation, elopement, suicide, a mental break. Her father, visibly aged within a week, offered a $10,000 reward for any information. No one came forward, but the truth is, someone had seen her, or what they claimed was her. A fisherman, half mad from drink, swore he saw her walking along the cliffs that night, her gown dragging behind her, face pale as bone, eyes black. He swore she stepped into the ocean as though it were a doorway, not water. They dismissed him. He was found a week later, washed ashore, mouth filled with sand, hands clasped around a locket that didn't belong to him. It bore her initials. That should have ended it, but the sightings continued. Every few years, a visitor or traveler passing through Newport claimed to see a woman matching Charlotte's description, always near the cliffs, always barefoot. But it wasn't just her. Something deeper had begun to infect the town. Families began reporting strange birth defects in children, seizures among those who ventured too near the abandoned part of the estate. Trees that had grown straight for decades began twisting unnaturally, and at night there were reports of distant humming like a voice singing from underground. An architect who had worked on the remodeling of the south wing revealed under duress that during construction, his crew had broken through into a subterranean room that was not on any blueprints. The chamber was octagonal, lined with mirrors, and completely sealed with a strange black resin. They sealed it back up without telling the family. The man was committed to an asylum the following spring. Charlotte's name, officially, was never removed from the family registry, a strange detail, considering the formality of the time. Her mother kept her bedroom untouched for decades until her death, instructing staff to clean it as if she was still there. The silver brush on her vanity was polished weekly. The dress she vanished in was never recovered, yet several seamstresses over the years claimed they saw that very fabric appear in their dreams, always soaked in seawater, always cradled in Charlotte's arms. When her father died in 1910, his will contained an unsettling clause that no one was to disturb the mausoleum until the final hour. What that meant, no one could say, but 3 days after his burial, grave robbers attempting to break in were found dead on the property, their eyes missing, their tongues severed. Local authorities closed the investigation with remarkable speed. By 1921, the estate had been shuttered and left to decay. Vines swallowed the windows, owls nested in the eaves. But the sightings didn't stop. A 12-year-old boy named Henry Weller, out playing with his dog, vanished near the estate's crumbling gate. Only his shoes were found filled with seaweed. In 1933, a journalist from New York attempted to document the house's history. He stayed 3 nights. On the 4th, he sent a telegram to his editor that simply read, "She's still here. The clocks are wrong." He was never seen again. His notebook was found, pages torn, water-stained, but one phrase was repeated dozens of times. "The velvet door opens inward." That line was later found carved into the back of one of Charlotte's childhood portraits. No one knows how it got there. Over time, Foster Hill became less of a landmark and more of a legend, a cautionary tale for children, a morbid fascination for thrill-seekers. But the deeper you dig, the more questions you find. Why were there unmarked graves discovered? In the orchard in 1958, graves containing the remains of children dressed in Victorian clothes. Why did multiple family members later report dreams of being called to the cliffs, hearing Charlotte's voice? And perhaps most chilling, why did the family never attempt to sell the land? Generations passed, fortunes rose and fell, yet the estate was kept in trust, taxes paid religiously, even as the structure collapsed into ruin. In 1976, a group of amateur occult researchers conducted an unsanctioned ritual on the grounds, seeking to make contact. Only one member returned, naked and bloodied, speaking only in French. She died 3 days later from cardiac arrest, eyes wide open. Her last words, "She is velvet now." What does that mean? Is Charlotte dead, or is she something else entirely, something that slipped between the folds of this world and another? Velvet was her favorite texture, her bedroom lined with it. But velvet is not just luxury, it is a fabric that masks depth, absorbs light, and hides stains well. The metaphor writes itself. By the early 2000s, urban explorers had managed to breach the perimeter and document the decaying remains, but their footage often contained anomalies, shadows that moved independently, reflections of a girl where no one stood, EVP recordings of a single word repeated. Remember, when analyzed, that voice matched 19th century recordings of Charlotte reciting poetry at a family gathering. The estate was finally sealed off in 2014 under federal artificial reason, preservation of historical integrity. Unofficially, rumors swirled that 2 agents investigating reports of cult activity disappeared inside the house. Their equipment was recovered, their bodies were not. The final twist. In 2019, a sealed box was discovered beneath the altar of a nearby chapel. Inside was a journal, believed to be Charlotte's. The last entry read, "They told me I had no past, but now I see the truth. I was never born. I was made." And the velvet remembers. No one knows what that means. But some believe the estate is not just haunted. They believe it is alive, conscious, and that Charlotte, the girl who vanished, is not gone. She is watching, waiting, and anyone who looks too closely into her story is at risk of being remembered by the velvet too. The drawing room clock struck midnight, and for a few in Newport, the sound barely registered, but for those who had been following the disappearance of Evelyn Winthrop, it echoed like a bell tolling for the soul of the city. The gas lamps outside Winthrop Manor flickered in protest as a summer storm rolled in from the sea, rain slapping the iron gates and streaming down marble columns like tears down a frozen face. Inside, Judge Alcott sat alone, hand trembling as he poured another glass. of Madeira. The glass was stained red, though not from the wine. Earlier that evening he'd been sent a box. Inside was a lock of jet-black hair and a single glove. Evelyn's. No note, no fingerprints. No one had seen who delivered it. The glove was embroidered with a tiny crest, most would have missed, a serpent devouring its own tail. He hadn't seen that symbol since the war, nor had he spoken it aloud since the day he sealed the records of the society. Now the past clawed its way back to the surface. He paced the room, memories colliding with the wind outside. Evelyn had asked too many questions. About the tunnels beneath the city. About the Winthrop orphanage her family quietly funded. About the disappearances during construction of the breakers' estate workers who were never paid and never seen again. She'd found something. The glove was proof. But where was she now? Across town, in the catacombs beneath the old Trinity Church. Two men lit lanterns and descended further into the maze of bones and soil. They weren't gravediggers. One was Dr. Fairress, a pathologist, whose reputation had been destroyed after he claimed a patient spoke to him during embalming. The other was Augustus Vail, known only to those who dealt in esoteric manuscripts and banned volumes. They carried a blueprint Evelyn had recovered from her father's study. It didn't match the known city maps. It showed chambers beneath. Chambers, vaults, and corridors that shouldn't exist, some marked with names not in English but in an older script, possibly Phoenician or something older still. Fairress and Vail were looking for the room labeled Vox Umbri, the voice of shadow. According to Evelyn's notes, it was the last place she investigated before she vanished. The tunnel narrowed, air growing colder as they pressed deeper. Vail paused. He held up the lantern and saw faint carvings on the wall's handprints, hundreds of them, small and childlike. They were seared into the stone, as if burned there by something not of this world. Fairress murmured that this place was never meant for the living. But they pressed on, driven by a force neither could explain. And then they heard it, a voice, impossibly distant, speaking in whispers that vibrated in their skulls. It was Evelyn's voice. She was reciting something, over and over, like a prayer or an incantation. Her words echoed from the darkness, ahead, but there was no sign of her, only an archway, ancient and covered in a thick, tar-like moss. Beyond it, silence. Back in the manor, Judge Alcott opened a safe hidden behind a portrait of his grandfather. Inside was a single item, an envelope sealed with wax. It was addressed to him, but written in Evelyn's handwriting. He broke the seal. Inside was a letter. It read, "If you're reading this, I've gone too far. The truth isn't hidden, it's buried. And not just beneath the earth. You were part of it once, all of you, the founders, the financiers, the judges. You promised secrecy in exchange for privilege, but that bargain demands blood, and now it wants mine. I found the children, not dead, not alive, changed. They spoke to me, not with mouths but with memories, and they showed me what you did. If I don't return, burn it all. Let this rot die with us." Alcott dropped the letter, his heart hammering. He knew she was telling the truth. The society wasn't a myth. It was a system, a machine, and its engine ran on fear, on innocence harvested and offered to something older than God. Evelyn had stumbled upon the offering chamber. That much was clear now, and if she lived, she wouldn't be the same. Down in the tunnels, Vail stepped through the archway. He found a circular room carved from obsidian stone, walls wet with condensation that seemed to pulse like flesh. In the center stood a pedestal with Evelyn's journal, open to a final entry. I walked in and the room closed behind me. It speaks through the walls, it feeds off what we forget. I saw myself older, broken, screaming. It said I've already chosen. That I came here not to find answers, but to become one. Then the walls shook, a low sound, like a heartbeat but stretched over miles. Fairress screamed as the shadows detached from the walls and began to move. Not as light, but as shape-formless and wrong. Vail dropped the lantern, flames licking the stone uselessly. Ikti grabbed the journal and ran, but the doorway was gone. Evelyn's voice rose to a pitch that shattered the silence. "Remember me," it cried, "or become me." Above, in the chapel ruins above the tunnels, a child stood staring down the steps. No one saw her arrive. She wore Evelyn's dress from the gala, perfectly preserved. Her eyes were milky white, unfocused. But when the priest asked her name, she whispered a name that hadn't been spoken since 1722, when the first Winthrop daughter vanished on the night of her debut. History wasn't repeating, it was looping, feeding itself. Evelyn hadn't vanished. She'd become part of the story, one that demanded to be retold, re-experienced, reburied, and now the next chapter had begun. The longer you look at the vanished years of Newport's Velvet Heiress, the less it feels like she disappeared, and the more it feels like she was erased. Not stolen in the dead of night, not spirited away in a romantic elopement, but methodically, deleted, cut out like a tumor by people who knew how to rewrite reality. Consider this. All the portraits of her in the Hale family gallery were painted over or moved to the attic. By 1892, her letters, once proudly preserved in mahogany drawers, were burned purposefully, almost ceremonially, as noted by the old maid Agnes, who told the parish priest that the family wanted to purify the record. What does that even mean? Purify the record. No one purifies something unless it's become unclean, and no one burns letters unless the contents hold power. That's the key. That's where you stop thinking of this as a mystery and start recognizing it as an operation. This wasn't grief, this wasn't shame, this was control. Erasure with a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. They didn't want people to mourn her. They wanted people to forget she ever existed. The trouble is, you can't erase someone who left such impossible fingerprints. That's what this story has always been about: traces, shadows, things that didn't quite get scrubbed out, like the photograph discovered behind the wallpaper in the east wing of Holey Manor, where renovations in 1921 revealed a small black and white portrait of a girl who was never documented, never named, but matched every eyewitness sketch of the heiress down to the velvet bow on her throat. The paper was brittle, water-stained, and glued directly to the back of the plaster, as if someone knew, even then, that her image would need hiding. And what about the silver comb found in the cellar? Walls, engraved not with her name, but with a cipher, 3 interlocking triangles forming a sigil no one could decipher until an exarchovist, with a background in esoteric orders, cross-referenced it with 16th century Italian codes. It matched the emblem of the Silent Daughters, a forgotten sect that believed in ritual anonymity, the complete spiritual destruction of the self to serve a higher, hidden cause. And if you believe that's coincidence, then you haven't been paying attention. Think bigger, think deeper. This wasn't a girl who ran away. This was someone taken, and not for ransom or romance, but for purpose. The kind of purpose that living rarely survive. The records left behind are riddled with holes, not because of time, but because of effort. Her school admissions were removed, baptismal records scratched out, property deeds nullified. Even the newspaper coverage of her birthday, Gallus previously front-page socialite, spreads were mysteriously absent from the archives of 1888, despite clear evidence that those issues were once printed. How do you delete physical newspapers from a city's record? Who has that reach? And more disturbingly, why would they use it on her? That's the madness in the quiet. The more insignificant she seems now, the more powerful she must have been then. The whisper that keeps surfacing again and again, especially from the surviving pages of the Wintertide Diaries, is that she wasn't just part of Newport society. She was meant for something, trained, groomed, maybe even chosen. The Hales were not just wealthy, they were something older, more entrenched, connected to the inner circles of maritime trade, occult finance, and silent benefactors of the wartime, projects no one ever fully understood. There are hand-scrawled notes recovered from her cousins, journal notes dated just weeks before her vanishing that mention the ceremonial and the velvet hour. One passage, translated from a ciphered Latin dialect, reads, "Her blood holds the key, her silence, the gate." What gate? To what? If you take that literally, you end up in places most people never come back from. But if you take it seriously, you start asking questions that force the entire narrative to shift. Maybe she didn't disappear. Maybe she transitioned, became part of something else, merged into the machinery of an older system, one that doesn't want fame, one that needs invisibility. The witnesses in the years after her vanishing become stranger and more fragmented the further you look. A housemaid in 1891 claimed she saw a girl matching the heiress's description, standing barefoot in the snow behind the Hale greenhouse, speaking softly to the frozen rosebushes. Another man, a railroad attendant, swore he saw her board a private car bound for Pennsylvania, flanked by 2 silent women in black veils. The most disturbing account comes from a sanitarium nurse in 1902 who wrote in a letter to her sister that a patient arrived with no name, no history, but a voice that could command silence with a glance. She was wrapped in velvet, and the staff were forbidden from speaking to her directly. That nurse died the following year, of influenza, they claimed, but there was no outbreak at the time. Look long enough and all the mundane explanations dissolve. What you're left with is a lattice of shadows. People who weren't supposed to see what they saw. Rooms that were sealed for reasons no one can explain. A girl born into privilege, groomed for something sacred or perhaps profane, and cut from the tapestry of known history, not lost, hidden, not forgotten, buried beneath velvet. The name she was given no longer opens doors, but the symbol that interlocked triangles has been found in more than one place since it appears etched beneath floorboards in an abandoned Baltimore orphanage. It's scrawled in the margins of private letters written by the British occultist Marlowe Heath. It was found tattooed on the scalp of a deceased nun in southern Italy, discovered only during autopsy, with no explanation in any of her religious records. These are not coincidences. These are warnings, echoes, and through them her story keeps whispering, refusing silence. Because the truth about the Newport Heiress is not that she vanished, it's that she was taken into something so powerful, so hidden, and so deliberately designed to be unspeakable that the only proof of her fate is the wound her absence left behind. The people who knew her are all dead now. The estates she walked through have been repainted, reconstructed, repurposed, but there are cold spots in those halls. There are rooms that no contractors will enter, citing tools that go missing, blueprints that shift, sounds that don't belong in the waking world. The velvet is still there, in some places tattered, sun-faded, but untouched by any renovation. No one wants to remove it, as if it watches back, as if it remembers. And in the minds of those who've studied this too closely, there is a phrase that recurs like an infection. Not written, not spoken aloud, but felt. She was chosen, she was marked. She was given to the order that waits beneath the fabric of everything, and now, as her sigil resurfaces, so does the purpose they took her for. It isn't over. It never was. It never was.